By the end of the 19th century, industrialization and growth had taken a heavy toll on nature. The startling extinction of the passenger pigeon proved that even a very prolific species could be brought to extinction, and it was that concern that drove future President Theodore Roosevelt to introduce conservation legislation and to start a conservation club. But he wasn't the only person at the end of the 19th century in America who was seeking to preserve the natural beauty to which Americans had become accustomed. One possibly unlikely candidate as a conservationist was Edward Avery McIlhenny. He was an adventurer, he was a naturalist and an ornithologist, but he was also a magnate of industry, the son of the inventor and heir to the company that produced Tabasco sauce. And he nearly single-handedly saved a magnificent species from extinction. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Edward Avery McIlhenny, for his whole life known as Ned, was born March 29, 1872, the son of Edmund McIlhenny and Mary Eliza Avery. Edmund made his money as a banker in Louisiana. Mary's family had run a sugar plantation. The Civil War ruined Edmund's banking fortune, and Mary's family home, called Avery Island, was burned by Union soldiers because it is not an island really at all, but actually a salt dome that raises 160 feet above the swampland. The Averys and Edmund had fled to Texas during the war, where Edmund supported the war effort from civilian positions, while the island became an important salt mine for the Confederacy, supplying 22 million pounds of salt during the war. Edmund lived with his in-laws on the island after the war, tending the family garden. Though it's a matter of some debate, at some point he began growing Tabasco peppers, named for the Mexican state from which they came, possibly with the assistance of a plantation owner who seemed to have been growing them since the 1840s. In 1868, he grew his first crop and began selling Tabasco brand pepper sauce. By his death in 1890, the sauce was selling all over the country. Ned McIlhenny enjoyed the outdoors as a child. He enjoyed exploring the island and the native wildlife. He attended several military schools as a teen and eventually attended Lehigh University, but he left before he could graduate to pursue a very special dream. He sought the life of an adventurer. In 1894, he likely paid to join the crew of the Miranda, an unfortunate ship that had been secured by explorer Frederick Cook. Cook had been the surgeon on an earlier expedition to the Arctic under Lieutenant Robert Peary. Peary and Cook would have competing claims for the first expedition to reach the North Pole in the first decade of the next century. Cook's expedition in 1894, though, was billed as a tourist cruise to Greenland, and Ned joined as the expedition's official ornithologist. The ship departed from New York on July 7th. The Miranda had a long history of accidents and had already sunk once in New York's East River. The ship hit ice on July 17th in the fog off the coast of Newfoundland and had to be put in for repairs. Set off again on July 29th. They arrived in Greenland a few days later, and Ned was able to collect some specimens of black-backed gulls. 2 days later, the ship struck a reef, and the captain determined that the Miranda was crippled. It sank entirely while being towed 3 weeks later, and likely all of Ned's specimens went down with the ship. From there he returned home to Louisiana, where his elder brother, John, had taken over the Tabasco Sauce Company and renamed it the McIlhenny's Son Corporation. When he returned, he noticed that there had been a dramatic decrease in the egret population. The hunting of egrets had grown from the middle of the 19th century, largely to satisfy the demand for plumes as decorations for hats. By 1885, plumes of birds like egrets, spoonbills, and flamingos were selling for as much as $20 an ounce. By 1899, 5 million birds were being killed a year, including 95% of Florida's shorebirds. The demand was especially high for nuptial plumes of snowy egrets, which they developed during breeding season. Demand was so great that hunters would often wait to shoot the birds as they came home to their nests. Conservation was a growing movement at the time, but it would be another 15 years before there was legislation to protect plume birds from hunting. And the snowy egret population had been devastated. Some estimates were that there were less than 250 remaining in the wild. Ned searched the nearby coast for surviving egrets and brought at least 8 chicks back to Avery Island to raise. He had built what he called a flying cage, an aviary made mostly of netting that enclosed a pond he had made by damming up a creek less than 200 yards from his home. In the fall, he released the birds to fly south for the winter and anxiously waited to see if they would return. Return they did, and the population of egrets on his protected refuge quickly grew. Every bush is loaded with snowy egret and Louisiana heron nests, one visitor said. By 1911, an estimated 100,000 snowy egrets nested in what he dubbed Bird City. Of course, the island naturally attracted many other kinds of birds, including spoonbills, herons, bitterns, and ducks. He continued to improve the space, adding nesting places, brush supported by cane frames, and a stand that he kept stocked with twigs for nests. Theodore Roosevelt called it the most noteworthy reserve in the country. After establishing the sanctuary, Ned sought to lead his own expedition to the Arctic. He came to an agreement with Dr. William Pepper, president of the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, to help finance a trip to Point Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost point of the United States. He succeeded by promising the museum all the specimens he collected. Beginning in 1897, Ned and two assistants gathered specimens at the remote outpost, renting an abandoned building once used as a way station by whalers. One observer called what they collected the finest quality that had been obtained. They collected 855 mammal specimens, mostly lemmings, but also 3 new species. They also collected 69 species of birds and 1,048 specimens, as well as a handful of insects in the form of bird parasites. While there, he played a role in the Point Barrow Overland Relief Expedition. In the winter of 1897-98, 8 whaling ships were caught in the ice near Point Barrow, and some 265 crew were stranded. The United States Revenue Cutter Service put together an expedition that struggled 1,500 miles over land to rescue the sailors. Ned agreed to let some of the stranded officers stay in his rented building and help to keep the men fed and warmed until the government team arrived to rescue them. A contemporary news report quoted Ned, who said that the government had brought 400 reindeer for food, but they were not needed, as we have killed over 1,000 caribou by hunting. Ned returned to Avery Island in 1898 in time for his elder brother John to join the Army and eventually the Rough Riders under Theodore Roosevelt. He even claimed to have saved the future president from a sniper. John left the Tabasco company to Ned, who would run the company until his death in 1949. He renamed it the McIlhenny Company and would go on to modernize the production and standardize the recipe. In 1927, he replaced the cork with today's twist-off cap. While he continued to market and grow the Tabasco Company, he also spearheaded numerous conservation projects. He began what the Bird Lore Journal called the Great McIlhenny Project, where he bought or induced others to buy land to put aside as a refuge for birds and other animals. In 1911, he donated 70,000 acres to the state as a refuge, and in the next few years induced others to buy more, ultimately securing over 200,000 acres as refuge, which remain protected today. He thought his work should be considered only the beginning of a project setting aside land north and south across the country to protect bird populations and migratory routes. In 1912, he began banding birds, attaching small aluminum bands to the legs of birds for research purposes, but found he wasn't getting much data. When he began using bands acquired from the American Bird Banding Association, he was much more successful. Over 22 years, he banded over 189,000 birds, providing important scientific data. In the 1920s, he worked on transforming his 170-acre estate into what is now called Jungle Gardens. Jungle Gardens is filled with animals, as well as a large collection of non-native plants, as well as ones native to Louisiana. In his collection are azaleas, irises, Japanese camellias, and bamboo. He became a very successful grower of bamboo and an advocate for its growth and use in the United States. Botanist David Fairchild wrote to Ned that, "You have been the great pioneer bamboo planter of America, and posterity will give you the honor that is your due for the great work you have done." In 1935, he opened the Jungle Gardens to the public, where it is still maintained to this day as a tourist attraction. In its giant garden is a 900-year-old statue of Buddha that was gifted to him by a pair of friends who apparently found it in storage in New York. Ned contributed numerous papers to scientific magazines about birds such as the snowy egret, sandhill crane, and the boat-tailed grackle, but wrote about other things as well. In 1935, he wrote The Alligator's Life History, which he had been studying since he was a child. More than 40 years later, zoologist Archie Carr called it the best existing account of the natural history of one of the world's most versatile reptiles. Ned claimed to have come across a 19-foot, 2-inch alligator whose length he measured using his rifle. There's no corroborating evidence, but if it is true, it would be the largest gator ever recorded. Ned also collected an enormous number of books about birds, hand-illustrated, that now make up the E.A. McIlhenny Collection of Natural History at Louisiana State University. It's been described as an incredibly rare and beautiful collection. He also collected from former slaves who lived on Avery Island over 100 spirituals, worship songs sung and written in slave communities, and preserved them with their musical melodies. Despite his conservation credentials, he also played a part in what has become an ecological disaster in Louisiana and other southern states. Nutria, also known as koi poo, are a capybara-like rodent now invasive in wetlands in the south. They were not first introduced by him, but he did breed them for fur. When they proved difficult to control and impossible to contain, he, like others who farmed them, released them into the wild. This was encouraged at the time because it was thought the rats could create a fur industry in the state. Instead, the nutria have proven to devastate local ecology by destructively burrowing and eating plants that help prevent erosion. It is an ironic legacy for a man so otherwise dedicated to conservation. Ned McIlhenny was many things in his life. Some $200 million worth of Tabasco sauce is still sold each year, and Bird City and Jungle Gardens remain as monuments to his efforts, as do the thousands of snowy egrets that still nest there today. While his work was largely amateur in nature, it led him to become an honorary lifetime associate member of the American Ornithological Union and many other conservation groups, and hundreds of specimens of both plants and animals that he collected are in museums throughout the country. Ned McIlhenny simply believed that humans have a responsibility to protect what they can of nature in the face of development. We often think that one person's efforts cannot affect enormous change, but Ned McIlhenny is proof that you can make great changes. You only need to look at the snowy egret as proof. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.